All right, let's go ahead and get started with our class this morning. We're a little bit past time, so if you want to open up to Esther chapter 4, we are just about to finish up that chapter and move on to the next one. So to sort of recap our story to this point, we've met King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, who is the king of Babylon and Persia, I should say. He's the king of Persia. He has fired his queen because she wouldn't come and present herself in front of him and his nobles when they were having a party. Then he decided to have a, I guess, empire-wide beauty contest to find his next queen. Esther, who is a Jew, applied for the beauty contest and won. He loves her, and so she became his queen. Then we get our secondary plot, which actually drives the action of the story, which is the story of Mordecai and Haman. Mordecai is a Jew who is also Esther's cousin, but older than her. He raised her and was responsible for helping her to get into the contest. He's also giving her instructions by way of a third party. And Mordecai is also a man who spends most of his time at the king's gate, basically outside the palace. While he's there, he overhears a plot to kill the king, turns in the information about the plot. The plot is foiled. The men who are going to carry it out are executed. Mordecai's name is written in the chronicles, basically, of the kings of Persia as someone who has done a great service for the king. Haman is the next and last major character in the story. Haman is a prince, would probably be as good a word as any, or possibly we would think of as like sort of one of many prime ministers or something like that. He's a senior official within the king's government, and he is one of the most prestigious of all of them. And ultimately, the king elevates him to the highest position short of himself. Probably the closest equivalent would be Joseph, with regard to the Pharaoh that we see in the Exodus, in Genesis. At that point, then, everyone in the kingdom is ordered to give him homage whenever he walks by, to bow down to him and stuff like that. But Mordecai won't do it because, as a Jew, he doesn't bow to anybody except Jehovah God. And so Haman sees this happen and gets increasingly angry about this, finds out who Mordecai's people are, and manages to convince the king of Persia to give him the authority, or to actually issue an edict that calls for the destruction of the Jews as a whole across the nation, using, and it's kind of unclear, Haman's promise to the king is, I will pay for it personally. It kind of looks like, in references later, that the money that he was using to pay for it was out of the treasury. Now, whether that means that he put the money in there as kind of like a guarantee to the king to say this is going to get taken care of, or whether it's because the king basically said, this is a good idea, you can use my money, you don't have to use your own. It's never entirely clear, but it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, this is an officially sanctioned kind of a thing where people throughout the empire are given the authority by the king to kill the Jews wherever they might find them, and their efforts are going to be paid for both by the money that's been set aside and also by them being able to seize whatever plunder they can from the Jews. So now we have our big problem, and so the next thing is the hero. And you can argue that Mordecai and or Esther are the hero, but Mordecai tells Esther what's going on. Well, first of all, he, puts himself in sackcloth and ashes and weeps and wails, and Esther initially doesn't know what the problem is. He eventually, through this third-party proxy, explains to her what has been going on and calls on her to do something, to ask the king to relent or to change his decree in order to save the Jews, to save her people. And initially she's reluctant to do that because why?
She's out of place doing that.
Okay, why is she out of place? What's the problem at the most basic level?
She wasn't invited. The king is sovereign, she's not, just because she's queen.
Right. So she doesn't co-rule with him, she's the queen, but she's kind of more of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Not even figurehead, that's not even the right word. She's an adornment, she's not part of the ruling process. And in order to come before the king, what has to happen if you want to appear before the king? Or if, in order to appear safely before the king, I guess I should say. One of two things has to happen for you to go in front of the king and not lose your head or whatever.
He has to do the...
He has to summon you.
Okay, so those, we got both of them from those ladies back there. One is if he summons you. So if you're summoned before the king, no problem, because he asked you to come there. Unless, I guess, he asks you to come there because he wants to have you killed, in which case it's going to be a problem. But normally, so that's one. If he doesn't go that way, if you choose to appear before him without being summoned, then he has to extend his scepter to you to show that he is accepting of your presence. And so in Esther's case, she has not been summoned for 30 days. Okay, if you look in your worksheet, if you still have that with you, the question number 7, talking what has happened for the 30 days before Mordecai reminds Esther she won't escape destruction. Well, it's that she hasn't been summoned. And the next question it asked, which is kind of interesting, is what are some of the things that could have happened at this time in the account? I don't quite know where they're going with that, to be honest, but it's an interesting question, I suppose. Number one, why would the king maybe not have summoned her?
The only thing I could think of is upset with her.
Okay? I mean, she has to be mindful that that's a possibility. Maybe for some reason he's upset with her, he just doesn't want to see her. Okay? What else?
He's got a harem.
Okay. My first thought was hers, then my second thought was Mark's. You know, he might have some other ways to amuse himself, you know? And so it's not as though he necessarily would have her in with him every single night or on a regular daily basis. And going back to something I think it was Steve that said is, she's not part of the ruling process, you know, any more than if you think about David's wives or Solomon's wives. I mean, David had a few wives, Solomon had 1,000 or so. They were probably not remotely involved with the actual governance of the kingdom. Now the scriptures tell us that the danger of having foreign wives was that they would lead the kings astray. And so it's not as though wives don't have any influence on the kings and on their husbands, but there's a difference between having influence kind of behind the scenes and being directly involved in the ruling of the kingdom. So for whatever reason, he has not seen fit to call her before him during this month, whether he's been just super busy or whether he's been amusing himself with other members of his harem or what he's been doing. There's not been that connection there. And that, I would think that would be sort of troubling to her from the context of then trying to go in there unsummoned. Because it's not as though, you know, he's been seeing her every, you know, several times a week or something like that, where she could expect that if she walks in, it's going to be, oh, you know, great, you know, it's kind of, we've been doing this consistently. She's in a position where she has to be concerned that he has found other things that are catching his attention or whatever, and that either because he's busy or because he has been involved with other members of his harem, that maybe he's not particularly interested in seeing her. So I think that's kind of a context where that may have, in terms of her saying he hasn't summoned me these 30 days, is more than just, I haven't seen him for 30 days. It's speaking to, I'm concerned that if I show up unannounced or unrequested now, that there may not be the relationship there to make that okay. You know, and that's what maybe that she's concerned about with regard to that. So Mordecai's response to her is, you know, we talked about it a little bit at the end of last week, which is, he says, you know, don't think that you're going to get away just because you're the queen. You know, don't think you're going to escape the destruction of the Jewish people. And he says, even if you don't get identified with this, even if you don't, sorry, I misstate that, even if you don't do anything, even if you don't try to help, deliverance is going to come from somewhere. God is going to save his people because we're his people. But if you don't help, the consequences in that situation will be bad for you and for your family. You and your father's family will suffer as a result of not having you not having stepped up when God clearly, or it seems, wants you to do something. I think it's kind of interesting. This thought just occurred to me right now as I was saying that. It's kind of an interesting threat that he makes, or maybe threat warning, I guess, let's call it a warning, that he makes, because he says, let me make sure I got this right, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. It's kind of an interesting thing to say, because why is it again that Esther was raised by Mordecai?
His parents are dead.
Yeah, so what father's house is there to get, you know, to suffer? I'm not saying that it is a trivial thing, but at the same time, it's kind of like, you know, Mordecai, you're the closest relative. Maybe this is not your best argument here, you know, or maybe this is more of a self-interested argument than we might have thought otherwise. But either way, it's kind of an interesting thing to say to someone who is essentially an orphan, but okay. So he ends with the sentence, this is in verse 34, and who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. And I mentioned last week, right as we were closing, that is a phrase that has become a fairly popular one in Christian thought and writings and memes and things like that. That idea of for such a time as this. What is Mordecai saying when he says that?
Well, he's saying God has placed you here at this time for this purpose.
Okay.
And he does that for all of us, but we're not all willing to do what he wants. And so you read about the ones that have done it. Like Moses, he was reluctant to do it, but he did it. And so it makes you wonder, though, did he approach someone else before that? And they said, no, I'm not doing that.
That is a really interesting question. And I think it's interesting because when we look in the scriptures, we can see certain people who, without them, fundamental things that needed to be done would not have been done. You know, and it raises the question: are there people who are indispensable? And like for Moses, in Moses' case, man, he did not want to go. You know, and God really had to sort of twist his arm to get him to go, but eventually he did. But like you said, what if somebody had been even less willing, had absolutely refused, or had been, you know, had done Jonah's thing and run the other direction or something like that, you know? It's kind of interesting because it raises the question, are there certain people where basically they can't say no? Or are there people where they say yes and we don't know the rest of the story and who else might have been called and wouldn't accept the call? The one that I think of the most besides Moses maybe is Paul or Saul. Because in his case, if you think about what Paul did, and you look at the development of Christianity throughout the world, it's hard to argue that there's anybody more important to Christianity except Jesus when it comes to the successful spread of the gospel. That Paul was at the center of making that happen. Not just in terms of spreading the gospel, but also laying the foundation in terms of the books that he wrote, or the letters that he wrote that became books, that help us to define what Christianity is supposed to look like in practice, what it's supposed to look like in practice. And so when you think about somebody like Paul, Jesus actually says to Ananias when he's telling him, go convert this guy, he says, I'm going to show him how much he has to suffer for me. But he's saying, I chose this guy. This guy is going to be the guy to do it. And so I think it's a really interesting idea that there's the possibility that there are, throughout history, there have been scattered people that God called on to do something who didn't do it, and as a result, somebody else stepped into their place and ended up being the person that the book is about, that the story is about. You know, because we don't see a lot in the Bible of people who refused and kept refusing. Now we see a few examples. We see Balaam and we see Jonah are the two that really leap to mind, where Balaam did his very best to try to go and prophesy against the people of God, and ultimately God wouldn't let him. And in the case of Jonah ran, and he had to go through a fairly unusual ordeal in order to be brought back onto the path that God wanted him to follow. But in those cases, eventually they did what God wanted to. So it's just interesting to me that thought that maybe there are people throughout history, that there are these sort of dead ends in history that didn't do what God wanted and somebody else got picked instead. Mark?
Yeah, I think too, we've got to think about, you know, in God's infinite wisdom, he's picking the perfect person in all of this. Yeah. Because Moses Pharaoh was one of his favorite sons. You know, I mean, one of the ones that was in the high court. Right. So he could really, at that time, move around pretty freely, and then he goes and then comes back as a Jew, really, and which he was already, but, you know. Right. But he could get away with things, I think, that they would have killed probably him for saying some of the things he did. But because of his standing before, maybe they didn't. And the same thing with Paul. When you think about Paul, you know, he's a Roman citizen that can move freely through the Roman Empire a little bit easier than some people. Yeah. He was learned. He he, you know, so all those things, you know, combined, God knows what he's doing, even though they may say, wait a second, why are you picking me for?
Right.
Well, he picked you for a reason, and the reason is these things because of that. No one else could probably have done the things that they did. But I think we forget that sometimes, that, you know, they're pretty reluctant, or what they had done to the church, like Paul before he started, you know, it took God to talk to them too. You know, when you think about it, I mean, direct, and Jesus talking to him, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
So I think that's a lot of it too. If we had that same thing today, would we be a lot stronger maybe?
Perhaps. With Paul, it's interesting that if you look at the other 12 apostles, the only other one that might even possibly have been a Roman citizen would be Matthew, because of his status as a tax collector, where the Jews didn't care for them at all, but the Romans liked them and they were useful to them. But you're right, none of the other apostles were remotely, and then you add on to all the different qualifications he had and languages he spoke and everything else, he was extraordinarily positioned to do that. And of course, with Esther, we see that exact same kind of a situation. And one of the things that's it's difficult to distinguish is, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's difficult to distinguish between providence and outcome when it comes to this kind of stuff. Because you kind of highlight, you know, these people are in exactly the right place when God calls them. But the flip side to it is they're in exactly the right place because God put them there, you know. And so for us, we have a normal way that cause and effect works. Something happens and that causes something else to happen, or a choice that we make causes something else to happen. With God, it's a little more complicated, because in many cases, the things that seem to cause the effects are in themselves being caused by God as something who's outside of the system, who's acting on the system to make things happen ahead of time. And so it's not just that he chooses Paul, and boy, we sure got lucky that guy was a Roman citizen and all this other stuff. Or, you know, he chooses Moses, and boy, wasn't it fortunate that he was wandering around on that mountain, you know, after having been raised in Pharaoh's quarter. Esther, boy, it's a good thing there was a Jew who happened to turn out to be the queen. We have to remember that these things don't happen by accident. And we see this on a large scale with these kinds of people, because the things that they do, the positions that they're in, are so significant. And we sometimes forget that doesn't mean it doesn't apply to us as well. Usually on a smaller scale. But nevertheless, these sorts of things do apply to us as Christians, that God is, in fact, putting us in the place to do certain things. And maybe it's not going to be to rescue an entire nation of people, whether it's from Pharaoh or whether it's from a stupid decree by a king who probably would never have written it if he didn't understood what he was doing. Or we're not going to be the ones who evangelize an entire continent the way Paul did or something like that. But that doesn't mean that we aren't put in certain places and given certain gifts. And they may not be the obvious ones. That's the thing is, we look at somebody like Paul, for example, and it's obvious if you think about what he was called to do. You can see all the things that made him the right person for that. You know, you look at someone like Esther, and at least you can see in terms of the position she was given, how that made her the right person for that particular job. But sometimes we look at our gifts and our abilities and the things that we know how to do, and we don't say, oh yeah, this sets me up for what God wants. We think this is utterly useless. And that's a mistake to think in those terms, because God is able, number one, to work with whatever He's got, but number two, there's a degree to which the things that happen to you, the experiences that you have, even to some extent the choices that you make in connection with the choices that other people make, put you in the place to do the things that God wants and to affect the things that God wants affected. And so we have to remember that principle as a consistent principle operating in our lives, not just something that operates occasionally and accidentally or apparently accidentally and only on a large scale. The scale is what really gets us into trouble. We think this isn't big enough, this can't possibly be from God, and that's simply not true. God doesn't just work on the large scale, He works on the small scale too. Think about, sometimes the small scale turns into the large scale, and that's one of the things that gets confusing in the scriptures, but when you think about God interacts with individual lives, with Ishmael and his mother Hagar, coming to her when he's not even the child of promise, coming to her and rescuing her in the desert because of his love for Abraham, and those kinds of things. So, okay, any other thoughts on that before we move on to Esther's response? Okay, so somebody read for me verses 35 through 37, which will be the end of the chapter. Chapter 4, I should say. Did I say? No, chapter 4 verses, 15, I can't read my own. 15 through 17, my bad. Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Then Esther told him to reply to Mordecai, "Go assemble all the Jews who were found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded.
Okay, so this is kind of interesting because this is actually the first time we see Esther commanding Mordecai. I think that's kind of interesting that her response back to him is, "You guys go do this," and he goes and does it. He doesn't argue, because of course what she's telling him to do is entirely sensible. And so she says, number one, what? What are you going to do? Call the Jews together, and what are you guys going to do? Fast, okay? 3 days, neither night nor day. Now there's two significant things in this. Fasting is one of them, and the night or day thing is another one. So fasting, why is fasting what she calls on them to do? We mentioned this earlier in the context of Mordecai when he was fasting as a result of hearing the news. But what is the significance of fasting?
Sacrifice?
It is a kind of sacrifice, yes.
When they fasted, they prayed.
Okay, so number one is fasting and praying are almost indistinguishable when it comes to the Jewish practice or the Israelite practice. So if they're fasting, they're going to be praying. But if we look in the old law, we find a number of different places where the commandment is to fast. Some of the holidays that they were supposed to do, there was fasting associated with it. A cleansing period before some kind of a religious ceremony sometimes involved fasting. But most of all, God says that when you are petitioning me, when you are seeking my favor, fasting is a way to call for that. Fasting is a way to get my attention, basically. And I think that ties into what Eva's saying about sacrifice. These Jews, they can't sacrifice animals because of the circumstance they find themselves in. We don't sacrifice animals at all because of the covenant under which we exist, but fasting is still something that is a sacrifice that we can make. In fact, in the Catholic tradition, that's the concept behind Lent, if I understand Lent correctly, is the idea you're giving something up. Now, whatever that's more of an individual decision, what that is exactly, but nevertheless, you're giving something up. And so, by fasting, we are denying ourselves of something our body needs, by the way, and that if you go too long without it, you'll die, but 3 days is not too long. Anybody who's of reasonable health can fast for 3 days and be fine. And so there is this aspect that we don't explore very often today of fasting in terms of a way to enhance our prayer life. What else does fasting do when you are praying, when you are trying to focus on God?
Get rid of the sin. Not sacrifice, but cleanse your body from sin.
Okay, I mean, for us, we don't really have to worry about that because that's what Jesus' blood does for us. But it does maybe help us in other ways. So how does fasting affect us when we're trying to focus on God and on prayer?
Kind of clear your mind a little bit
Okay.
so that you're concentrating more on Him.
Okay, so you're deliberately choosing to set aside something that we spend quite a bit of our time doing, cooking or eating or whatever. And think about when you go to a restaurant, how often does the discussion at the restaurant turn to other places that you like to eat? You know, I mean, like I can think of that almost every time where I'm at a restaurant. I end up with having a conversation. Oh, this place is good and this place is good. When you're eating, you think about food more, and food becomes a big focus. And that's not necessarily a good thing just in general, but it's definitely not a good thing when you're trying to focus really hard on one particular thing that you're trying to pray about. And so a lot of the thing, and people report this who fast on a regular basis or who use fasting and prayer together, they report that they generally find themselves, maybe not in that first day or so, because in that first day or so you're just thinking, man, I'm really hungry. But after a day or two, they report that the thoughts about food tend to go on the back burner, at least for a while. Now, eventually you go long enough and your body's going to start screaming at you, you need some food, and there's no way to get around that. But before that happens, that there's a period of time there where your thinking about food gets kind of shuffled off to a very, very small corner of your mind, and it allows you to focus a lot more on the prayer and on whatever it is you're meditating about it and what have you. And so fasting is, I don't think that's an accident that it works like that, you know, that our minds work like that. And so fasting is something that Jews are called on to do from time to time, and that arguably Christians are called on to do as well. Not with the same ceremonial applications in terms of specific holidays or different things like that, but in the sense that there are times when we're called on, when the scriptures, I should say, we see examples in the scriptures of Christians fasting for various reasons, particularly in conjunction with praying about something that's particularly important or of deep concern. Now, the other aspect that is interesting is she says, fast for me, do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. The significance of that is that in many cases the Jewish fasting was done only during the daytime. From sunup to sundown was when you would fast, and then in the evening you could eat. Now the idea wasn't that you gorged yourself in the evening to make up for what you didn't have, but the idea was that you would fast during the day and you would eat a reasonable meal in the evening time. In this case, Esther is saying not at all, no food at all, to maximize the whether it's the level of sacrifice or to maximize the attention that we're calling on from God. However we want to look at it, I want you to do it all the time. No eating, no food at all. So, she says she and her maidens will fast in the same way, and then she's going to go into the king, and she just has to throw that dig in there, which is not according to the law, and then she says, and if I perish, I perish. The question that this worksheet we're working with says, how do you explain what Esther meant when she said, if I perish, I perish? I'm not sure that we find it all that difficult to understand what she meant by that. It's basically, if I go in and he doesn't extend me the scepter, I'm going to die. But the critical thing is, why would she be dying in that situation? What would be the reason for her death at the heart of it?
The insult and disobedience to what is a law.
Okay, you're actually one level further along than I want us to think. Below that, the only reason we get to an insult and disobedience to the law is because she makes a choice to go into the king, and what's driving that choice?
To save her people?
To save her people. So if she dies, and does it because of the reasons that Steve is giving us, at the core of it, it's because she's serving God and she's doing what is best for his people. So there is an important principle in here that we understand. I think we understand already, but let's kind of rehash it for a second, which is that there is no shame or dishonor or error, I think is probably the better thing to say. There is no error in dying in the pursuit of the service of God. That's just the truth. We've seen that throughout all of history, that the people of God are willing to lay down their lives in his service, and they often do. And sometimes it works out great. Most of the time in the scriptures it works out well. Sometimes it doesn't work out so good. That's one of the things I mentioned last week in the sermon talking about the thing in Hebrews. You start off talking about these guys who have all these great successes that were written about in detail in the scriptures, and then the Hebrew writer launches into all the people that didn't get mentioned in the scriptures because they didn't get the good outcomes. They ended up sawed in two and wandering around and dead for various different reasons and stuff like that. And those people are the ones that are kind of the background chorus for the song that's in the front of the scriptures. But the fact is that the willingness to lay down our lives for God is not something that Christians should ever be afraid of. And that's, I think, the core of what we get from what Esther is saying here. So what are some of the question, then we see the 10th question there is, what are some of the strengths and spiritual qualities that we see in Esther? What do we see in Esther that's noble or good, something that we can benefit from putting in our own lives? Or
Sacrificial love.
all right, sacrificial love for her people. And okay, what else?
I wrote, she had faith that God's will would be done.
Okay. So whether it was going to be by her or by something else, she believed that God's will would be done, just as Mordecai did. Okay, what else?
I wrote that she became a leader. She took control of the situation a little bit there.
Okay.
She told Mordecai, here, do this, and then she went ahead and did what she needed to do.
Okay.
She didn't sit back and say, I'll see what God does.
Okay, so she's not passive, at least not when she's called on to do something. Now there's one level above that, which is Mordecai's level of, when I hear a problem, I'm actively, immediately going and looking for a solution. In her case, she needed somebody to sort of jog her and say, you've got to go do this. But once she got that, she then proceeded to do something, to act, and not simply to be passive or try to let it, work itself out or whatever else, okay? Anything else anybody else sees in her?
Wisdom for a young woman,
Okay, how so? I agree, but how so?
and asking him to go and to do what he, with fasting.
Okay, so I think it's really important to recognize this is spiritual wisdom. It's not just human wisdom. Paul makes distinctions about that in a number of different places, but she has the spiritual wisdom to recognize that this is not going to succeed or fail because of the artifices of humans, that this is going to be God, and so she calls on Mordecai to lead the Jews in fasting and prayer, not in some political petition or whatever else it is. She's focused on the spiritual things. So that's an important trait that we see in her. Anything else? One that jumps out to me is that courage. The willingness to do something that's scary, even when you don't know what the outcome is going to be. There's courage there. When you know the outcome, good or bad, there's sort of an inevitability to it, to what you do. But when you don't know what the outcome is going to be, it takes a lot of courage to choose to do the thing that has an unknown outcome that can be very bad for you. And that's exactly what she's looking at here, is a very bad possible situation. Okay, anything else we want to talk about with regard to Esther's character? Okay, let's go on to chapter 5. We don't have a lot of time here, but I want to go ahead and read chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. If I could get someone to do that for me, please.
Okay, now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on the royal throne in the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. And it happened, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. When the king said to her, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it will be given to you." And Esther said, "If it please the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him."
Okay, so I don't know if we'll get through all of this because there's kind of a lot to unpack here, but so it comes on, it's the third day, so Esther they've been praying, they've been fasting. Esther puts on her royal robes, and it says she stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms, with the king sitting on his royal throne. So she's entered into his presence unbidden. And we got to realize that probably wasn't an easy thing. It probably wasn't she just walked in there and didn't have time to reflect on the decision that she was making, because to get in there she would have had to go past the king's royal guards probably, and perhaps some administrative functionaries or something like that, all of whom are probably telling her, you didn't get called by the king, you better not go in there. So she's probably got reminded on more than one occasion in the course of getting to where she is here that this is a bad idea. And so she goes in there. Now, one of the things I think about is, have any of you, I'm guessing all of you have, but have any of you ever had that experience where you have something you have to do, you don't know how it's going to turn out, and you're afraid it's going to be bad, and you have that pit in your stomach, when you're going to do that, whether it's, you're going to a meeting with a boss that you don't know how it's going to turn out, whether it's you made a bad decision, you did something wrong, and now you have to be held to account for it, whatever it is, or whether it's just, you're getting ready to say something or do something and you don't know what the outcome's going to be. There's that feeling you have, that like your feet weigh thousands of times what they normally do. You can't hardly breathe, and there's that, like I said, there's that sense of weight in your stomach of just, you almost can't bear the sensation of that. I got to think that that's exactly what she's feeling in this moment when she goes in front of the king, because You don't, she doesn't know. And it's not just about her safety at this point, it's also about saving her people. And so there's this huge weight that's on her in order to do this. I suspect it is the same thing that Moses probably felt the first time he appeared before the Pharaoh, that Jonah probably felt the first time he started talking in front of Nineveh, that each of these people that we talked about already who were called to do these things probably had the same sensation the first time they actually did what they've been called to do. And here, Esther almost surely feels that way. And so she stands there in front of the king, and we see it says that the king saw Esther standing in his court, and she obtained favor in his sight, and he extended to Esther the scepter. And it's kind of interesting because, it's more than interesting, there are two aspects to this. The question, though, that we would ask is, why does he extend the scepter to her? What do you think?
Well, I think he likes her, but,
Okay.
you know, I'm not actually going to answer that question.
Okay.
I was going to ask one. So
By all means.
I find it interesting that in this location, and also we see in the New Testament, where the king is offering up to half his kingdom. Do you think that's just a kind of a generous phrase, or is that a reality?
It's probably, it is almost certainly a, what would you call it? I can't get the word for it. Where you're stating an excessive version of the truth.
Exaggeration?
Exaggeration. There's another word for it. That's as good a word as any, since I can't think of the other one. There's a word for that when you're basically, you make, I could eat a whole horse kind of thing,
Hyperbole.
Hyperbole, thank you. That is exactly the word I'm looking for. It's hyperbole. But there is an underlying truth that represents. So when you say I can eat a whole horse, what does it mean?
You're really
I'm
hungry.
extremely hungry. So you don't, most people of my generation or older don't say something like that unless they mean to convey the idea that I'm very, very hungry. Now, I will tell you that you go a couple of younger generations younger than me, they have no sense of the significance of hyperbole. So when I used to work with the youth at Ida Road, and that was 15 or 20 years ago, so it's even worse now. Every movie they'd ever seen was the best or worst movie they'd ever seen. There was no in between. It was pretty good. No, this is the greatest movie I ever saw, or this is the worst thing that ever, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, or it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. There's no nuance with kids. Now, maybe as they got older, they learned to use the language in a little more of a nuanced way. But for the most part, my experience with a lot of them has been they didn't. I can tell you from doing the master's program at ASU, working with students who would have been in their mid-20s and college educated, that they had not learned how to speak in a more nuanced way. But nevertheless, I think that when we use hyperbole, we see hyperbole in situations like this one, it does convey an underlying truth. We say it's as hot as the surface of the sun outside. We don't literally mean that. Of course we don't literally mean that. What we mean is it's extremely hot outside. We're conveying the idea that there is truth behind this that doesn't rise to the level of what we're saying, but that rises to a significant level. We're trying to convey a magnitude that we would not normally try to convey. And I think that's what's happening here, and I think that's what we see in the New Testament as well, that when a king says something like that, they're not saying literally, I'll give you half of the kingdom. With the exception of Joseph and in this story of Haman, the kings don't do that. But what the king is saying is, I am the king, and I have the power and resources of a king, and I can make things happen. I will make things happen to you that go far beyond what anybody else could do. And I think that's really what the king is trying to convey with that kind of hyperbole. It's kind of, in a way, I think, linked to some of the promises that we receive from God. Not in the sense that I think God is being using hyperbole in what he promises, but in the sense of part of the reason that those promises are so significant is that they're coming from the creator and ruler of the universe. And when somebody who's, your coworker or whatever says, you're my friend and I'm going to take care of you, that means something very different than when God says, you're my friend and I'm going to take care of you, And so I think that's kind of what the king is conveying here, is not, I'll literally give you half of the kingdom, but I have the power to do anything you can ask, basically. And I will do pretty much anything you can ask. And so I think that's what he's saying. But I don't know. I mean, given that we, like I said, the only times we've ever seen kings give away half their kingdom, and even then it wasn't strictly half their kingdom. What they were doing was giving tremendous authority to people, in particular in certain cases. But even in those cases, in both the case of Joseph and Haman, the king reserved for himself the ultimate authority. Whereas this seems like a promise where it'd be like, let's split the kingdom in half, and Esther gets half, and I get the other half. That's not probably what he's literally meaning. So, I think, and the other aspect of this, I think, is when you hear someone with that kind of authority say, "I'll give you half the kingdom," what it basically says is, don't be afraid to ask big. And I think that's another thing we see in our relationship with God, is God tells us, don't be afraid to ask big. Jesus says, you command a mountain to throw itself into the sea and it's going to do it. That's asking big. That's not little things. And so I think the king is saying that to her as well, is don't be afraid to ask for something big if it's important. And so when he calls on her to ask him for anything, then that's, I think, what's driving that. So, and to go to the question I asked, and we got to wrap up here. I think that what we see there is, as you said, is that he likes her, he loves her, and so when he sees her, even if he hasn't called her for the last 30 days, he is reminded of all the things that made him choose her to be his queen over whoever else he might have been sleeping with for the last 30 days, whatever else he might have been doing. He's reminded that this is the woman I chose, this is the woman that I love. And of course, then on top of that, we have a far more powerful pressure, which is God wanting a specific outcome. And when God puts pressure on the human heart, it's pretty hard to say no. So I think we have both of those things that are driving what's happening here. So we have to stop. Next week we'll pick up with what Esther actually asks for, which seems like kind of an odd choice, but we'll see where that's going, and we'll talk about whether that was something that she was planning all along, or whether she just got nervous and didn't ask for what she really wanted to ask for and kind of hedged her bets. But we'll talk about that next week. So.